So, Hannah, there's an awful lot of procedure going on. Explain to us exactly what Alok Sharma, who's chairing this session, and the rest of those delegates are doing here.
Well, to start with, there was a sort of procedural handing or ceremonial handing over to the next presidents of the COP. So that's COP27 and COP28. That's Egypt and the UAE. So that happened at the beginning. And now, essentially, he's going through the bits of the agreement that have already been arranged and committed to, the non-controversial parts, basically, which is why you can hear Alok Sharma and others reading out these long agenda item names. It's very hard to follow, but it's not particularly controversial or surprising right now. The stuff that matters, the stuff that will define the success or failure of this COP is still being negotiated, crucially, behind closed doors, these teams of negotiators now working through the night in a couple of crucial areas. Finance is still a real problem, in particular, how much money will go for adaptation measures to poorer countries. There's still issues with the global carbon markets discussion, and poorer nations really want there to be a sharing of funds associated with that. That's obviously quite complicated. There is a big row now brewing around the language of the fossil fuels. That's at the moment in the cover agreement text, and it says that countries should all commit to phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. Saudi Arabia, Russia, Australia and others are pushing really hard for that to be removed. But the EU and the US and the UK are starting to dig their heels in. I think to start with, there was maybe a view that that fossil fuel language wouldn't survive. But now there's a sort of head of steam to keep it in, which is very interesting.
But it's also extraordinary, the idea that you can have an agreement on reducing emissions without mentioning fossil fuels. And it is unusual, isn't it, to even coal to be named in an agreement at a COP.
That's right. It hasn't been included before, as mad as that sounds. And that's just because it takes such a long time to get all of this stuff sorted out. And there's so much back and forth between the big polluters and the more developed economies who are much happier to include that language because they've already made the commitments, they already have the technology in place, they have the targets set, and they kind of bound themselves legally within their own domestic frameworks to do it, which is why this stuff is so complicated. And, you know, we've got another row in a separate negotiating room, which is ongoing about getting all the countries to say, yes, we are going to come back at the end of next year with enhanced targets for reducing our carbon emissions. So that's 4 big buckets of problems, negotiators working all the way through the night to get all this sorted now.
Well, yes, and as you say, not long to go until that deadline. And I understand that you caught up with Frans Timmermans a little bit earlier, obviously the EU's climate envoy, essentially.
Yes, Vice President of the European Commission, the EU's climate envoy. And they actually have been accused of not doing enough, not raising their voices enough, which, of course, he pushed back hard on. But he is one of the individuals really pushing for that fossil fuel language to stay, and I asked him about it.
Well, we will do everything to prevent that from happening. I believe it is incredibly important that we at least have a text that says we will stop subsidizing fossil fuel. We're not even saying stopping fossil fuels, we're saying subsidizing.
The Saudis are pushing really hard to remove it. Are they going to be successful?
Let's wait and see. I think many of us are pushing the other direction.
So that's Frans Timmermans being, you know, really giving a little insight there that it's all about back and forth now and who wins the power battle. What next? Well, we're waiting for that near final cover agreement text to drop into our inboxes overnight, and tomorrow we'll be pouring through the detail to see how much progress has been made and who has won those power battles.
And whether or not 1.5 is still alive at the end of it all.
Crucially, absolutely.
OK, Hannah, thanks so much for explaining that. We appreciate it. Thank you. Well, we will, of course, keep a very close eye on events there in that session as it continues, and we'll get you up to date. But in the meantime, let me just fill you in on some of the other news from COP and elsewhere in the climate sphere. And Scotland's First Minister has urged world leaders to step up in the final day of negotiations at COP26. Speaking to Sky's political editor, Beth Rigby, Nicola Sturgeon said a deal is within reach.
There are only perhaps a few hours left of the negotiations here in Glasgow, and leaders really must step up and do whatever it takes to get the deal that comes out of the Glasgow discussions to where it needs to be. It should be within reach, it is within reach, but it requires political will and determination. It is leadership from the highest level of governments across the world that is required. And I would call on Boris Johnson to come back to Glasgow. He was here yesterday, I welcome that. In his shoes, I don't think I would have left.
British defence firm BAE Systems is creating new sustainability apprenticeships as part of plans to reduce its carbon footprint. The company hopes that the programme will help it to reach net zero by 2030. And Jarvis Cocker has teamed up with the electronic DJ Riton to release what he calls the world's first sustainable banger. Let's Stick Around aims to encourage actions to address the climate crisis. The Pulp frontman has long been an advocate for climate action, with members of Extinction Rebellion joining him on the Q Awards red carpet in 2019. Now, the beautiful island of Madagascar off Africa's southeastern coast is one of the countries desperately in need of more money from developed nations to help with the impact of climate change that it's experiencing right now. Drought and hunger are forcing people to take extreme measures just to survive, including destroying the country's habitats. Deforestation and illegal mining are the only option for many who have no other way to make money, but they in turn are making the climate crisis worse. Well, in Madagascar, an estimated 500,000 people are involved in illegal mining. For many, it's the only way that they can make money, as around 75% of the population live below the poverty line, earning less than $2 a day. Sky's special correspondent Alex Crawford has this report on how illegal mining on the shores of Lake Aotra has devastated the ecosystem.
The mountainside is a mass of tents, pockmarked with illegal mining shafts and mounds of dead grey soil. The forest which was once here is now long gone and unlikely ever to return. Instead, there are men like Ali doing probably the most dangerous job in Madagascar today. They are desperate men, turning to desperate ways to survive. He and his team have dug this tunnel out by hand. The flimsy plastic tube alongside him is taking the only air that will keep them alive down here. Within seconds, the surface and safety, as well as light, is left behind him. It's jet black without his head torch. He has no protective gear at all and is inching his way down in his bare feet. It takes him a full 2 minutes to be lowered down the tunnel. He and his two other friends are now more than 70 meters down, crawling in a space just big enough to take them, without a support beam in sight. They're digging for gems, which they hope will change their lives forever and haul them out of poverty. Trouble is, the last time they found anything of any note was 8 months ago. A piece of beryl they sold for 2 million ariary, about $500, split amongst the team of 7. Not exactly the fortune they're dreaming of. Above ground, Lux is in charge of the most important job. His main task is ensuring air's pumped continuously down the shaft. But they're working with crude, inadequate material. And Ali's not down there long before the vital airbag splits.
What's happened? Is it broken?
Yeah, it's broken.
Now, for sure, he'll be having trouble breathing, his colleague tells us, as the team tries to patch together the lifeline with tape. Underground, the break in the air supply is rapidly noticed. But the lack of panic seems to indicate this is a fairly regular, potentially deadly hazard. They often pass out down here, but it doesn't put them off. Air restored, and they resume digging for their dreams. What I'm looking for is here, Eve says. Be brave, Ali tells him. I'm always brave with my work, his friend replies. All around them, there's equally risky but continuous activity. Around 6,000 people are working here alone. All this spawns a multi-million-dollar smuggling racket and black market in Madagascar, little of which makes its way into these miners' pockets, but which massively contributes to deforestation, affects wildlife and weather patterns, as well as the climate. This is just one illegal encampment in one part of the country. There are an estimated 500,000 people who are taking part in illegal mining. If you look here, you can see it goes on for some distance. That would make it the second biggest employer in the whole of Madagascar, and more people are being driven into it because of poverty, and of course that has a big impact on their habitat. The miners are strikingly positive despite their lack of success, and the frayed equipment they rely on doesn't seem to influence their nerves. Ali and his crew are unperturbed by the dangers or the impact on their homeland's precious environment. Any laws preventing this illegal mining are unenforced.
How was it, Ali?
They've all spent all their lives doing this and say they've no alternative. I'm not afraid at all, he says. I'm used to this work. I make my living out of it, and I'm not afraid. But the forests are coming down at an unrelenting pace in this, one of the most biodiverse nations on Earth. This logger told us he expected to bring down 100 trees that day, and he's in a team of 10. The trees are used for firewood, for cooking and selling, as well as making way for illegal mining. But every loss of every tree adds carbon dioxide to the air, affecting the climate and endangering wildlife. And again, poverty is the driver. Robert will make $10 today, 5 times more than most of his fellow citizens, the bulk of whom are living below the poverty line. Back at the illegal mining site, a gem buyer is driving a hard bargain.
Bill, no good.
There's a crack in it, he says. This group of families have been working 5 months to collect this amount of beryl. The gem buyer offers 5,000 ari. There's nothing good here, he says. But Fama in the lime green shirt is disgusted. He's got 15 relatives to feed. He's being offered just over $1 for months of work. He's not selling today. The gem buyer shows us what he considers good quality precious beryl gems. He reckons he'll get $25 for all this, a fraction of what they'll fetch when they're turned into rings or earrings, and at an enormous cost to Madagascar's unique environment. Alex Crawford, Sky News in Madagascar.
To Brazil now, and the Atlantic forest, which stretches for more than 2,000 miles along the country's eastern coast. Only a small area of the original forest remains due to logging, urban expansion and land being used for agriculture. But now a project is aiming to protect what's left. Mark Austin met the biologist reforesting the hillsides of Sugarloaf Mountain.
On Rio's famous Sugarloaf Mountain, they're trying to restore the forest below to what it used to be.
The Atlantic forest is a kind of rainforest, like the Amazon.
Biologist Roberta Guimarães de Souza is overseeing a project to regrow the area with native trees.
So in the Amazon, we saw deforestation. Here, there seems to be regrowth and reforestation.
It's a matter of climatic adaptation for us. We need to have our forests restored.
So it's not just an issue of the carbon that is stored here, there's other issues as well with the forest.
It's a matter of survival for us because we have many natural disasters in Rio. People from the communities up in the mountains, they usually lose their houses when it rains. It's happening already. For the last few years, we've suffered in the summer with too much rain, and in the winter with complete lack of rain and lack of water. It's amazing, but we have lack of water in the rainforest. We don't have water, we don't have clean air without the forest. The forest hold the land in its place.
But when you have a president who doesn't seem to care about this, that must make it very difficult.
We feel like this person doesn't belong here, you know, as if he was sent by someone else. He's working for other people, not for us.
When it comes to climate change, he doesn't represent the Brazilian people?
No, no, definitely not, no.
So when you see in the Amazon what is happening, what do you feel in your heart?
Man, if they know how hard it is to restore, how costly, and to grow up a seedling, to put it in place, to study, to know the right tree, to where it goes, the right species, and the time it takes, it's years. This forest, like it's 200 years old to get at this stage. No, in the Amazon, I think they are just used to see forest, and the people go there with, the people who deforest, they go there with other economic reasons to grow cattle. They really don't care, but we have to restore it if we want to survive. And that will cost a lot of money.
Scientists agree on the need to save these forests. In Brazil right now, it is the political will that's missing.
Now, cutting down trees to help tackle climate change might not sound like an obvious thing to do, but one estate in Scotland is doing just that. And it's all to do with rewilding and restoring natural peat bogs to help absorb carbon dioxide emissions. Our science correspondent, Thomas Moore, reports.
The hills above Loch Ness. And on the Bunloit estate, they're cutting down trees for the good of the planet. These spruce were planted several decades ago on a peat bog, but scientific analysis has shown the peat is now so dry and damaged that it's releasing more greenhouse gases than the trees are absorbing. And on balance, the trees have got to go.
It is a bit counterintuitive. But we have to take down our plantations that have been planted in the wrong places, like on our peatland bogs, and restore that as a habitat in itself. And we have to manage our woodlands better so that they are meeting biodiversity targets.
Comprehensive measurements of carbon in the estate's trees, peat and grassland have underlined how important nature could be in mitigating climate change. The Bunloit estate is just 1,200 acres in size, yet it stores the equivalent of more than 1.2 million tonnes of carbon. That's 2% of Scotland's annual carbon footprint, and it'll be released if nature degrades.
Scotland is a man-made wilderness. Centuries of sheep grazing, sport shooting and tree felling have shaped the landscape. Now estates like Bunloit are trying to rewind the clock and rewild nature.
Camera traps reveal the estate's hidden wildlife. Restoring nature would be a win for biodiversity, the climate and green jobs.
About 60,000 trees are grown in the nursery each year, sort of different sorts of ones, mainly for the very high ground.
The nursery at the organisation Trees for Life gives clues to the scale of their ambition. They want to replant 500,000 acres, linking estates across the Highlands to the Atlantic.
The Highlands are beautiful, but in many ways they're an ecological desert. Much of what should be here isn't here anymore. But there are remnants, there are patches of the original Caledonian forest, beautiful peatlands that can be restored and nurtured and be the sort of source of a wider landscape change.
They're coming round now.
But not everyone's convinced. Angus McFadden has 1,300 ewes, several dozen cows, and he says plenty of wildlife on his farm. He doesn't see the sense in covering good land with trees.
These hills that I'm farming on, because of legislation that's there now, couldn't take trees. I'm talking about things like the depth of peat, the steepness of the banks. We couldn't plant trees on there, so better a good moorland management scheme, proper grazing regime to help store the carbon.
At Bunloit, they're hoping to show rewilding, farming and forestry can coexist, but it'll take generations and funding to replant the Highlands and use Scotland's landscape to hold back the climate crisis. Thomas Moore, Sky News, Loch Ness.
Well, time now to discuss all the climate issues of the day and the developments here at COP with John Verdick, who's Director of the International Climate Policy at the Nature Conservancy. So welcome to you. So we're just 24 hours off the scheduled end of COP26. So how far away from a deal are we, and what are the key sticking points that still remain?
I think we're close, although close in COP time means maybe 2 more days. COPs tend to go over a lot. This is quite normal in this process. The key sticking points, there's a big negotiation going on in how do we make carbon markets work? How do we build up climate finance? And then also, what is transparency? The Paris Agreement is really important and based on transparency. So we're finishing up the rules on how do you report on your greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, and as far as that is concerned, there's been a lot of talk of countries coming back in just 1 year. I mean, originally under Paris, it was every 5 years, wasn't it? So the idea that people come back more frequently and are put under pressure to improve their targets, is that going to happen? Is that what is likely to be in the final text?
I mean, there's some discussion of that being in the text. I think actually Paris said 10 years or 5 years because it didn't say. So you saw China come with a 10-year commitment in Paris. United States come with 5. They were both right because neither was wrong. Now we've actually built out that guidance a little bit in the last few years. It said it was 5. There's talk of 1, but just like in many of our organizations where we work, if you do a reorganization every year, at some point you have to do the work on the ground. So sometimes doing a new plan every year doesn't work. For some countries, especially if you're democratic and you change them 1 year, you might have a new leader that's going to be more robust.
And what about the finance? Is this all about enough money for developing countries to transition away from fossil fuels? Or is there an argument about how the money's spent, whether more of that money should go towards adaptation, for example?
Yeah. I think there's 2 sides of the coin. One side is the emission reductions. The other side of the coin is how do you get the emission reductions? And if you're a developing country, how you get those emissions reductions is the climate finance. Many of the developing countries also are not large emitters. So they're trying to think of what can they do and what does climate change mean to them? And it means something different than what it does to the EU countries, to the UK, to the United States. But very important to them is figuring out still how do they feed their families? How do they provide energy?
Well, yes, and as far as money is concerned, what needs to be agreed here? Is it more money forthcoming or a different way of it being allocated?
I think there's kind of 2 things. One is the finish up of the $100 billion by 2020 pledge, and that actually flatlines until 2025 until it stops. So I think what we'll see come out of this negotiation will be a directional point towards what do we get next year or the next year. But I don't think we're going to get a number this year. But what we need to do is see if the developed countries can make up. They're about $10 to $20 billion short on that $100 billion commitment.
And the one other line of text that seemed to be controversial, which sounds extraordinary to anyone outside this process, is the fact that it included a commitment to phasing out of fossil fuels and reducing subsidies in fossil fuels. Apparently it's very unusual for that even to be mentioned, and there are some countries who rely on fossil fuels who aren't happy about it. So is that line likely to stay in or not? And does it matter if it comes out?
I think it's a signal. It's a very important signal, and you have to remember that the United Nations has purview over governments. It doesn't get to tell all private sector what to do. So in a way, those lines sometimes are saying, what do we do here? But outside of the negotiations is a whole nother world. What we can push in our own countries, make our own legislatures push, I think that's where we're going to really get that fossil fuel change.
And you were a negotiator in Paris, I believe, so you understand that feeling of success at the end of a COP. Do you feel that we're going to have that mood when this does end, even if it's not tomorrow, if it's later in the weekend? Does it feel like we're heading in that direction?
I think so. I think it looks good. Usually at this point of the days, you can kind of watch the negotiators. A lot of them are nervous, they're tired, they're being broken down by the process, which is part of the process, the idea. Make people start to change what is a red line and to softly give it into a pink line and maybe trade it at the end. So as I'm seeing negotiators, they're starting to work together rather than holding hard red lines. I think we've got something coming.
And that's something we'll be keeping 1.5 alive?
I hope so. I think we saw in the commitments that were made in the last week and over the last year of new NDCs coming in, that we've gone from about a 2.7 degree trajectory down to about 1.9. That doesn't get us to 1.5, but it's certainly bending the curve in the right way.
Best guess for the end time?
Saturday at 2 p.m.
Saturday 2 p.m. I'm getting a range of guesses. Thanks very much indeed, John Verdick. Thank you. Now, don't forget you can listen to a new Climate Cast every day from COP26, wherever you normally find your podcasts. And also, you may well already be watching this on our pop-up channel, but if you're not, you can find uninterrupted coverage from COP26 between 9 a.m. and 7 p.m. on channel 525 and Sky Glass channel 505. That's it from me.